So welcome. If at any point you can't hear me, just let me know. It's a new sound system, so we're working out the kinks. Thank you for coming out in the cold. It's nice and warm here, though. We're going to keep you warm with our heat and with our discussion, both of us. So welcome. I don't think I've had Scott at Fordham yet for an evening, so welcome, Scott. You are a frequent visitor. Well, I'm going to have to just speak really loudly. Let me tell you a little bit about Scott before we talk about his book, which I hope all of you get to read. Scott, it's hard to pick a description of Scott, but I think maybe human rights activist and lawyer, both human rights lawyer and other kind of lawyer, which if you want to explain, you can explain at some point in time, but don't have to.
Less is more.
Less is more. But the way Scott's come into my life and into a lot of people who work on civil liberties, national security, terrorism, etc., is that somehow he appeared not on a faculty, not necessarily as a journalist at the time, as somebody to explain the legal issues to us at the very beginning of this odyssey in 2001, 2002, 2003. Do you remember that? And all of a sudden, he became an extremely valuable force in explaining to us the world we were in, the world we might be headed towards, and the way to articulate and understand the law, both the domestic law and international law. So it's no surprise that he wrote this book, which, when you see it, actually surprised me when I read it. So I want to say a few things about it. Scott is most known for taking a stand on Guantanamo, on torture, on warrantless surveillance, on drones, and we're going to get to all of that. But this book begins with almost 100 pages on the theory of secrecy and the democratic state, and how individual philosophers, all whose names you would know, nobody too esoteric, have understood what it means to have a government that is increasingly secret, and how dangerous that can be, but also how important certain elements of secrecy are to the viability of the state. So it's not this is not the theory of why secrecy should be thrown out the window. It's why secrecy has to be understood and treated like the precious commodity that it is, and only used in as tenuous and responsible a way as possible. And so it's actually a very thoughtful exploration of what secrecy is, what it means, and how we've seen it in the past 10 years. So we're going to try to cover all of that today. We're going to end at 7 like we always do, an hour after we started, so maybe a few minutes after 7. There will be plenty of time for your questions. But I'm going to start by asking a few. And the first question I'm going to ask Mr. Horton is, what are Lords of Secrecy? And how on earth did you come up with this title?
That's a very good question. You know, I have to be completely candid here and say, it's one thing when you write an academic book, but when you do a book that someone actually wants to sell 20, 30, or 40,000 copies of, and you give them a dry academic title, the response comes back immediately, no, you're not doing that. So it came from a dialogue with the publicists. And but I think there are good reasons for the title selection. So the name Lords of Secrecy is designed to make clear that people who are using secrecy now, by and large, are not elected officials, and they're also people who are less and less accountable under any sort of legal system. So who are the Lords of Secrecy? They are the senior figures in America's national security and intelligence communities who exercise under American law the power to create secrets, and they use this power for many different purposes, but an important one is to expand their own power and influence, and particularly to lay claim to certain subject matters as their own, where they are more and more the only people who are able to speak to those issues, the only people who are able to provide advice to the executive, increasingly the president, on those issues, and thereby influence the decisions that are taken. and that's particularly decisions surrounding war and peace. And if you had to take one single example of the Lord of Secrecy, you want a face that you can remember, I would give you Richard Bruce Cheney. Because if you have read Bart Gellman's book Angler, and if you haven't, I'll put in the part for it, it's a great book. You see from the beginning of that book how Cheney, who spent a large part of his career in that same world, was of course Secretary of Defense for a very long period of time, how he was obsessed with secrets, that is, the power to make secrets he saw as an essential adjunct of political power. And he was so obsessed with it that he used it for his own purposes. He created his own security classifications that didn't exist under law, and he created his own stamps with those classifications that he used. And I think we saw in the Bush White House, you saw Cheney as a master of secrecy, pushing an agenda, and that agenda was principally, in the first 4 years of the Bush presidency, going to war with Iraq. And we saw secrecy being used to block scrutiny of very important factual claims that were being made to justify that war. That included the notion, repeated over and over again, that Saddam Hussein was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, and that Saddam Hussein was manufacturing weapons of mass destruction, or actually had weapons of mass destruction, propositions of which Cheney claimed to be absolutely certain based on his access to secrets, which none of you could know about.
Okay, well, but I want to go, anyway, I want to go more into this notion of forgetting Cheney for a minute. You know, where do you draw the line? I think secrets, I'm just going to play devil's advocate here, but I actually mean it. I think secrets can be very important, and they are very important to holding power. So where do you draw the line between knowing that you have an entitlement to certain secrets and doing what Dick Cheney did, which was on the far side of using secrets in a way to freeze out the rest of the government? And what I'm really getting at here is President Obama. It's one thing to talk about Dick Cheney as a long time ago, in our lifetimes, but what about how we hold power, how people hold power, even in a democracy, and what are they entitled, and you talk about this in the book a little bit, what are they entitled to hold on to? And then I'm going to get to what is the public actually entitled to know. So what about Obama? He's not Dick Cheney. You argue in this book that secrecy is now the way we do things when it comes to the national security state. So is Obama any better, or is it just a pattern now that we've fallen into and we're going to stay that way for the foreseeable future?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote this book was to look at secrecy in a theoretical context that links secrecy to a form of government, to government structures. And I think that's, to have any really meaningful discussion about their role in society, that's an important factor to consider from the beginning. And I go back, I discuss this issue from the perspective of philosophers in Greece in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, and then from the perspective of sociologists and others. But I would say throughout that entire sweep, there's a clear understanding that secrecy has a role in every government, no doubt about that. And it's very difficult to talk about secrecy all on its own, standing apart from everything else. Rather, you've really got to look at 3 different factors and how they play out. And those are secrecy, privacy, and publicity. And those 3 concepts exist in every society. And how they weigh out against one another ultimately tells you a lot about what this society is. And this is an idea that goes back to Aristotelian notions of the state. But generally, it's clear that a democratic society places a maximum on publicity. and an authoritarian system places a maximum on secrecy. And in fact, this is one of the surest tests of authoritarian governments. So authoritarian and totalitarian governments are states where secrecy plays an absolutely overwhelming, overarching role over everything. The privacy rights of individuals are reduced to almost nothing. The publicity obligations of the state are also reduced to almost nothing. So there's sort of a bargain in which the state says, we'll guarantee your security, and in exchange you give up your privacy, and you give up your right to know what the state is doing. That's the essential authoritarian bargain. So I think you've got to view all these issues against that political construct. And I think when we look at the introduction of secrecy in the American national security state in 1947, of course we've always had secrecy in the United States. It's always been here from the time of the Revolution. No state exists without secrecy in some way. But it was sort of an episodic thing in American history until the arrival of until we had that explosion in Los Alamos, frankly. And then in 1947, we saw the construction of a new state, which some political scientists call the Trumanist state, or we could call the National Security State, from the National Security Act of 1947. And this was the first effort to deal consistently with a state that had to maintain secrets and had to maintain them rigorously. And this issue, when you go back and you look at the dialogue that was going on in the background involving Truman and Dean Acheson and Stuart Simonton and many other people, this was a huge issue. So I think there was a sense that there was a really severe risk that secrecy left uncontrolled could just strangle democracy, or it could exclude proper public discussion and debate about national security issues from democratic process, when in the U.S. experience that had always been the core of democratic process in the United States. So there was a very careful effort made to ensure that there was always enough information present. And I think that model had its ups and downs, but was largely successful through the end of the Cold War. So what we have now is a new crisis with secrecy, which comes from the post-Cold War era, which in my mind is just bizarre, because we're not dealing with a threat that promises annihilation. We're dealing with an enemy which is actually relatively unsophisticated, has weak weapons, and uses tactically weak tools to deal with its adversary. But nevertheless, against that threat, we are seeing a far more aggressive assertion of secrecy than ever before. And that brings us to your question about Obama. And to me, one of the really amazing things is, if we track this from the end of the Cold War, we can see different administrations with different attitudes on secrecy policy. Clinton to Bush to Obama, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan and his pushback for a post-Cold War dividend, and so forth. But there's really been remarkably little change in the secrecy practices of the American bureaucracy. That's stable all the way through, which shows that to a very high degree, it's insulated from these partisan political policy discussions. They just don't matter that much. The bureaucracies are going to do what they're going to do, and they're not taking no for an answer. And I think that's a lesson that Daniel Patrick Moynihan figured out in the last few years of his life, in fact.
Right, so that brings us to what I think the book really was titled before your publicist titled it. Tell me if I'm wrong. Which is the rise of the intelligence state. But this book
National surveillance state.
This book is about the intelligence mandate after 9/11 and the way in which it, as one person I once talked to said, in a Pac-Man-like way, ate up the rest of the government.
Yes.
And that is one of the most interesting takeaways in this book is So can you describe for us the difference in concrete terms between the size, you talk about bureaucracy, what was the intelligence bureaucracy before 9/11, and what is the intelligence bureaucracy now? And as, you know, as factually in terms of institutional developments as you can muster.
So the immediate answer is, we don't know. I mean, we literally don't know. It's the black budget. It's secret. We're not supposed to know. It would be dangerous for us to know how much money we're spending on the intelligence community, right? We all understand that proposition, don't we? In the 9/11 Commission, I think one of their most significant recommendations was there's no valid reason for the budget in broad terms to be secret. You know, the American people should know what is being spent in this sector.
The intelligence budget.
The intelligence budget, exactly. There is no legitimate reason for the bottom line to be secret. Why is it secret? Because jaws would drop everywhere in the country if people knew how much money was being spent. If we compare expenditures today with the Cold War, parentheses, when we really needed to spend this money, facing a threat of annihilation, we're looking at 4 times more money, I'd say. We're probably around there. In any event, we are now looking at a CIA budget that is clearly in excess of $50 billion a year. And we're looking at a total intelligence community budget that is anywhere from $85 to $100 billion a year. So just viewed in terms of the entirety of the federal budget, this is an enormous chunk of the discretionary spending that our federal government does. And yet there are enormous, evidently irresistible pressures to avoid any information about this coming out, to avoid it being discussed, challenged, questioned. You know, we should know nothing about it, and we should never discuss it.
Okay, but we know
it's there.
Yes.
Okay, so we know it's there, we know it's big, we don't have to know the exact, you could argue, the exact dollar form. What I'm interested in is, and I know the answer to the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, has the intelligence agency affected the development of the State Department, Treasury, Department of Justice, Homeland Security, or is it only 22 agencies on their own? What's happening inside government, even if you're not inside one of these 22 intelligence agencies, from your perspective?
Oh, well, I think there's no doubt but that, you know, certain agencies within the community are winners and others are losers in this battle for.
So who are the losers?
I mean, the State Department is the perennial loser, has always been the loser, has been. I mean, you know, the CIA was launched with the motto, bigger than state by 48, and they won. So that's in year 1 of the CIA, they exceeded the State Department budget. And I think other agencies get the clear idea that, you know, there is a huge amount of money available for certain kinds of intelligence work. So you want the money, you go do that kind of work. And I just say, you know, you hosted recently the director of the FBI here. You know, did anybody ask him when it was that the FBI changed its mission from law enforcement to intelligence and national security work?
Actually, that's a very interesting point, because, you know, when he was at his confirmation hearing, he described the FBI as an intelligence agency.
And what drives that is money. That money is available for this area. And, you know, criminal justice, enforcement of the law, who cares about that? And, you know, those budgets get scrutinized.
But it's not just money. It's also the philosophy of what we're going to spend our money on. And let me just say, I mean, your book shows this, so I may as well say it, which is that prevention, as the be-all and end-all of what law enforcement does, is necessarily an intelligence prerogative. Correct?
That's correct. I also say accountability. So, you know, less accountability goes with this in all forms.
We're going to
right?
get to the accountability. We can get. This is my next question. Is that the other part of So first I want to ask you something else. Is Benghazi, what happened in Benghazi and the controversy over Benghazi, part of this intelligence versus State Department tension that we've just been talking about?
I think it shows the absolutely bizarre ways that intelligence issues become distorted in American political dialogue, which frequently have to do with American partisan concerns, one way or the other, and very little to do with actual intelligence issues. So, but I would say Benghazi points to something very, very important in intelligence terms, and that is, with the end of the Cold War, there was a massive refocusing of intelligence collection and analysis efforts away from the former Warsaw Pact and former Soviet Union and towards the Middle East, which previously had been probably the secondary area of concern for our intelligence community. And so that occurred. The resources that were being deployed were massive, I mean, almost unimaginable. And yet, time and time again, when major questions came out, we discovered that our intelligence community, and particularly the CIA, didn't have a clue. And that's particularly when we look at the Arab Spring. So, I mean, the Arab Spring came and they didn't see it coming. They were downplaying the initial events in Tunisia as, sort of local uprising of no broader concern. But, actually within weeks, it was lighting a fire that went from Rabat on the Atlantic Ocean to Oman, the entirety of the Arab world. So they did simply miss that. And the situation in Benghazi, I mean, we have this political dialogue, which is, I mean, I have to say, frankly, I have difficulty even understanding what it is. I once tried explaining to some visiting Libyan officials what the whole discussion about Benghazi was, and they just looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, no, it's a domestic American political dialogue. The huge issue in the background has to do with, why the diplomatic facilities were opened in Benghazi, why the ambassador was sent there, why a very large CIA delegation was sent there. And when we peel back underneath, we see the CIA decided it was going to make a critical play to reach out to certain factions in Secrecy, in the eastern province of Libya. And it felt that it scoped it out and decided who our friends were. And this was a big effort to do that. And of course, unbeknownst to them, our friends weren't our friends. They were our enemies. And that had fatal consequences. So I'd say Benghazi reflects, just a gross intelligence error and a poor or very weak analytical capacity. And that's a huge issue for the United States, and yet we never really see any meaningful discussion of that. And I just point out a couple of things in the background there. One of the most important is that the way the CIA is going about spending its money is to build and reinforce connections with national intelligence agencies in each of these states. Now, when the Arab Spring came up, these were the intelligence agencies in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, and so on. These were the targets of the protests. So of course the intelligence services had no interest in telling the CIA, oh, everybody hates us and they're trying to overthrow us, which is one of the major reasons why the CIA was off the mark. But even after the Arab Spring, this process of bonding with those services has continued, and it has led to us being tied to people who do not represent our values, are detested throughout the region, and who do not provide us with valid or useful intelligence, a complete strikeout, but an extremely expensive one.
So you would put the failure to predict anything about ISIS in the same category?
I would say yes, and I would say, again, a sort of systemic, total analytical failure with respect to Syria also falls into this category. So it's, I mean, just generally when you think about it, you know, I mean, more than $50 billion a year just to the CIA, and, you know, the quality of the intelligence is worse than reading a current issue of The Economist. You know, we're not getting our money's worth, I just put it that way.
So you could have a large, well-funded, extremely well-funded, overly well-funded intelligence agency or network of agencies, but if they functioned well, that would be accessible. That would be more acceptable or acceptable.
Yeah, I don't think the issue here at all is to shut down the CIA. So I think a nation, you know, like the United States, I mean, we are the global leader. We are the paramount military power in the world. A lot of people hate us, but we have also the most historically extensive system alliances in the world today. We have to have an intelligence network, and we have to have good intelligence analysis. And I would even say the total amount that's being spent isn't completely unreasonable. My point is we're just not getting our money's worth with this. The quality of the analysis is absolutely pathetic. And by the way, we can't have a discussion about that, you know, can't have it, you know. And indeed, they don't even want to publicly admit what their analysis was.
Right. So let's talk some of the specifics. Let's get into the NSA a little bit. Right. We still have, I mean, we're not going to go through the whole history of it here, but basically what happened since 9/11 was an erosion of protections against surveillance, particularly we can talk about against people in America or American citizens, without warrant, without notice, without anything. Where do we stand in terms of what's happening with the NSA today? We've had a series of OIG reports, we've had a series of journalists write about it. We're more and more knowing what happened, how pervasive it was. We've had the Snowden leaks that have led us to a lot of things. Where do we stand in terms of today's, except what goes on at the NSA today, do we know?
Not much change from the period of peak abuses. I mean, of course, today we had a major report put forward by General Clapper talking about reforms and implementing Obama's reforms. So, you know, there have been a series of, I'd say, significant pullbacks, but, you know, not affecting some of the most important issues. And I'd say at this point, probably long-term, I would say data trawling that affects hundreds of millions of people around the world who are not suspected of anything, and long-term storage of that data. Those are the top issues, frankly. And I still don't see anything addressing that. But I think we should step back and say, how did we get there? We got there as a result of there being no legal or policy check imposed on the expansion of the NSA. So it was effectively whatever they technologically developed the ability to do, they could do.
Who did they tell?
And who did they tell? Their own legal counsel and selected other persons in the national security community. So I would say certainly they had customers in the State Department and the CIA and the Department of Defense and then the White House who knew about this, about all these capacities, but I would say information about many parts of the program were not widely known. And one in particular, PRISM, was very, very tightly controlled, and that was tightly controlled, I believe, firmly. It was tightly controlled because the authors of the program understood from the beginning that it was not a lawful program, and they were very concerned about avoiding it being publicly known or being subjected to legal challenge anywhere, because they thought, and they turned out to be right, that it would not succeed if it were legally challenged.
Right, and you give, mentioning Mr. Comey again, credit for being one of the few people inside government, lawyer as the DAG at the time, Deputy Attorney General, to say, look, this is not something we can live with, and that brings us back to Bart's book. But what happened to the NSA after that?
there were very minor changes to accommodate their concerns, and the program went forward. So, you know, I mean, yes, I give him credit for having the nerve to raise objections and say no, which at that time, very, very few people in Washington would do. But then, of course, we had Barack Obama, who gave speeches in 2007, 2008, talking about the abuses of a surveillance state, promising that if elected, he was going to bring that all under control, and failing to do that.
Okay, I want to, before your questions, get to the two other topics in the book that we're going to deal with today. One is drones. It's very interesting how you make the jump from the surveillance state to the drone state, because, you know, drones are first surveillance tools, and then potentially targeted killing tools. So do you see this as a logical, that this happened as a logical thing? Why are we using them? Why does this fit into your intelligence apparatus, the idea of drones? Is it, I mean, you go about it in different ways in the book. One of the things you talk about is that, since who told, you're saying, who told the FBI they're an intelligence agency? The question you ask in your book is, who told the CIA they were a military organization?
They were the Air Force.
Right. Who told them that they were supposed to militarize? I think that John Brennan takes over as the head of the CIA, and he says, we're going to go back to what we used to do. Right?
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the things I think in the book is if you go back in military history over many, many centuries, you see that frequently technological innovations, military technological innovations, when not taken into account properly, can wind up having just dramatic consequences on the nature of the state, how a state operates. And I think drones reflect that in the United States today. I think we have this huge public debate about whether whether the president had the authority to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, and okay, with all respect, that's not the issue. I mean, I just don't see that as a huge issue. But the emergence of the CIA as its own Pentagon, with its own Air Force, and with the power to wage war around the world without public discussion and knowledge, and without approval in any way from Congress, that's a huge issue. That's changed the nature of our national security state. And to me, it is just shocking that there are so few people who cover national security issues in Washington and New York who understand how significant an issue that is. But I think that's, in part, that's the power of secrecy. So they don't discuss this issue, people don't know about this issue, because this issue has been stamped secret, as the drones have been stamped secret. And even though you might have an academic running around saying something that decided they're all going to talk about Anwar al-Awlaki, okay, instead of the bigger issues. But even then, if they raise the policy issue, you'll find that people from the government can't talk about that, because that's a covert action program that we can't discuss. And in fact, if you look at even John Brennan's speeches or President Obama's speeches, they're just weird. I mean, rhetorically, they're weird speeches, because they never say the CIA is running a drone war in Pakistan. They say, I mean, it's all passive voice. So-and-so was struck by drones, and this was a huge success for the United States. I mean, it's just like, what? You know, they can't speak in active terms about what's going on, because that would be to betray the existence of a covert program. So, and this creates fundamental problems for democratic dialogue in our society, and for the relationship between our democracy and decisions about going to war.
You start your book with torture, and you start it with the Senate Intelligence Committee report. And then you come back to torture every now and then inside the text. In this larger scheme of intelligence, law enforcement, surveillance, drones, drone killing, where do you see torture? Was it a blip on the screen? We made a mistake? Is it something that's indicative of the larger framework? How do you see it? And it's surprising you start the book with it, by the way. I'm just saying, so why?
I would say torture historically has always existed side by side with secrecy. So states use torture, and they don't want people to know about the fact that they use torture. And you go back to English jurisprudence and the High Gothic Age and the Renaissance and so forth. That's the principal use of torture, of secrecy in the law courts, is to avoid having to publicly acknowledge that we're torturing people. So it runs, it's sort of a hand in glove sort of thing. So I see, the torture is one of the things that drives this obsession with secrecy and justifies it. And I started out talking about the Senate Select Committee report on torture and the black site programs. And to me, there's some very, very interesting disclosures in that report, but to me, the long choreographed dance between the CIA and the Senate Select Committee that led to the issuance of that report is at least as important as the content of the report, because you're seeing how do the Lords of Secrecy use secrecy as both a shield and as a sword against those who will expose their mistakes, their errors, their illegality. And you see a absolutely remarkable repertoire of tricks being pulled out. From the very beginning, they say, we have to note, by the way, first of all, that the idea of this report, it was Michael Hayden's idea, director of the CIA. He went to the Senate committee and told them, some of these tapes a tape was destroyed, and then of course we know 92 tapes were destroyed. But you shouldn't get upset about that, because we have plenty of alternative documentations of all these things. So all the necessary records are there in place, and you can come and check it. And then staffers went over and started going through the materials, and they went back and they reported, yeah, there is a lot of documentation, but this documentation does not reflect the program that was disclosed to the committee. It reflects something really quite different, and we were stunned at the things. And that then leads to the entire report being commissioned. And then we see the CIA saying, sort of thinking like commercial litigation lawyers in New York City, we have to do our own internal review for relevance before anything's turned over to you. And we're going to, because we don't have people who are free to do that, we're going to hire contractors to do it. Too sensitive to show to you, but we'll hire contractors who otherwise wouldn't be seeing these materials to review them before we show them to you. And review for relevance, who has the ability to make a final determination on relevance in these matters? The Senate committee does. So why contractors, and it goes on and on. Also insisting that CIA offices be used, that CIA computers be used, making a reference to the Department of Justice when the Senate team gets its hands on the Panetta report, which is the CIA's own internal review of the same documents that they're reviewing and so forth. So it shows the CIA having quite a bag of tricks, which they play very effectively. And, the Senate committee looked like rubes compared to them. The CIA, in fact, slows down the process by 3, 4, 5 years through this game.
So you said the word, but I was going to bring it up anyway, because we're at a law school. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the role that lawyers have played, because that's the book we all want to write. What is the role that lawyers have played in your mind, if you can sort of describe it from the very beginning until now? How important are they to the process?
Well, lawyers they're central to the process from the very beginning. But that, I don't mean that in a good way. And I think
that's what I mean, because you mentioned the lawyers, you mentioned Obama's lawyers that come in They come into the same part of the Department of Justice that is responsible for the torture memos, et cetera, the surveillance memos, right? They come in, they write their own memos, they happen to be drone memos, but they write their own secret memos authorizing this. So is it just that the Justice Department essentially now does what the administration wants? What is the role of lawyers right now in government when it comes to these secret policies?
I would say specifically we have to say that there is a species of lawyers, national security lawyers. And national security lawyers,
My best friends are
they seem to build their careers by telling their bosses what their bosses want to hear, to be perfectly frank. And those who wind up at the top are those who always find a way to say yes to any request. There seems to be nothing that is so outrageous that they can't find somehow a legal justification for it. And they are the guardians of prerogative within the executive branch, and that includes being the guardians of secrecy. So when you stop and think about it, that's sort of instinctive for lawyers. I mean, we're told, you're supposed to protect your client's rights and privileges, and, we think about, some criminal defendant or some indigent, but no, in this case we're talking about the Secretary of Defense or the Director of the CIA or the President of the United States. Yes, the lawyers, the national security lawyers work very, very hard to protect their rights and privileges, and they also work very hard to create rights and privileges that did not historically exist, and to insist that Congress doesn't have rights and privileges that it historically and constitutionally clearly has, and to denigrate the rights and privileges of the citizenry of the United States, which is the most lamentable aspect of the current phase. So they've had an immense impact in this entire process. And we saw that just in the SCSI report process that I talked about. There's one particular lawyer, Robert Ettinger, whose name appears 1,600 times in this report.
CIA lawyer.
And he was the acting general counsel at the time the report was being finalized. And it is clear that he used every trick in his bag and every power he possessed to try and block that report. Of course, a report that would be and was devastating to him and his professional reputation. So not surprising and yet regrettable. And he's faced no negative fallout from that whatsoever. We also have Robert Power, who was brought in by John Brennan to do an accountability assessment. I mean, the word is even sort of laughable, of CIA agents who've been involved in dirty tricks targeting the Senate committee and who were singled out by the Inspector General in a very detailed, beautifully prepared report. And they issued a conclusion exonerating everybody. And I have to say, one morning I sat down and I read the Inspector General's report and their conclusion. I thought their paper was one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. I mean, it starts out from page 2, reciting as facts things that are definitely not facts, they're not true, over and over and over again. But, finding as facts things that had to be found as facts to absolve the individuals involved of any accountability. So that's another role that lawyers play here. And civil liberties lawyers and human rights lawyers, also play a role. But, their role is limited to, litigation in the courts. And the scope of action that's been allowed for courts is so narrow, there's very, very little to be done, very few rights to be protected or vindicated there anymore.
So if there were going to be some kind of accountability, people usually mean accountability for violating the law, when they talk about accountability in terms of the excesses of the national security state. But you're actually talking about, and you mentioned it again here as at the beginning, accountability for just doing a really bad job. What's the relationship between accountability for breaking a law and accountability for not doing your job well? Is there a relationship between these two things?
Yes, I mean, one of my major arguments here is that, accountability, it's ridiculous to look at violations only in terms of criminal law accountability every time. I mean, there tends to be a strong focus on that. But in fact, the palette of options that are available to deal with someone who has behaved corruptly or wrongly or exercised poor judgment is far broader than that. But let's view this in the context of secrecy to start with. So this is a point that the sociological scholars who looked at bureaucracy and secrecy going back a little bit more than 100 years ago now flagged from the beginning. That is, bureaucrats love secrecy. And national security bureaucrats especially love secrecy. They're obsessed with it. And how do they use this secrecy? Well, it's used for appropriate purposes to keep military secrets, diplomatic secrets, maybe keep your tax returns secret that the public is not entitled to know, so private individual secrets. But predictably and very, very frequently, secrecy is being used to cover up mistakes. So it may be just a boo-boo, an innocent boo-boo. It may be something far more serious. It may be that the bureaucracy involved had a program. The program was a disaster. By the way, read yesterday's newspapers for the Afghanistan Accountability Review, where all information about the Afghanistan army was suddenly declared secret, and then that decision was reversed 24 hours later, basically to avoid public disclosure of very, very serious corruption report. But then you have questions of criminality, frankly, where there's been contract corruption. And if you classify something as secret, it becomes very difficult for a criminal investigator to get in, to discover the facts, to deal with it, and to take action. It can become almost impossible for that to occur. So we get all these different usages, and they're very current today. In one part of my book, I talk about the sociological theory, and then I look at a whole series of cases coming out of the CIA in the course of the last 10 years, where we see just a clear demonstration of this, where individuals who made serial gross errors and acted probably corruptly rose to the top of the agency and are still at the top of the agency right now. And I say secrecy enables that to happen. In fact, this is one of Max Weber's ideas. Too much secrecy makes the government stupid, he says. Because incompetent people, less capable people, will predictably rise to the top of the government if they can use secrecy in this way to protect their errors. And I think we, with people like Alfredo Francis Bukowski, I think we see that in clear cut. This is a person who's right at the top of the CIA today, who should have been removed from the service many years ago.
Who is one of the big revelations to many from the Senate Intelligence Report. Time for your questions? Yes. You can wait for the mic if you want. Yeah.
You've spoken a lot about the failures of people and their personal interests, and you broached the contracting out of security. The contracting out is not a new thing in the American experience. It goes back to the very beginning of the country. But as far as our national policy, and you brought up the Arab Spring, a third of a century before we had a profound failure of intelligence in Iran, and a quarter of a century before that we had a profound failure of attention in Iran. And there's just one place in that region. And the potential beneficiaries were private interests, part of the revolving door. And I'm wondering, is our national security and our corporate security or corporate interests in effect one and the same? And if so, how do we get out from under that? Is there a way out?
Well, in the mind of certain lieutenants of industry, they are the same, but I wouldn't say that would be a fair or objective description of the interests of the United States as a democracy. But I think you're right. So I would say the role of contractors is a major area of transformation, though. So Yes, there were contractors fighting in the Revolutionary War as boat builders, for instance, and quartermasters working with the provisioning of the Continental Army. So yes, from the beginning. But look at the situation today. In fact, to sort of trace it back from the time of Vietnam, where we had a ratio of roughly one contractor to 60 men in uniform at that time. And then we go to the Bosnian or the Balkans conflict, where it was about 1 in 6. And then we carry it forward to Iraq, and in the course of the Iraq conflict, we began to approach a parity relationship between contractors and uniformed personnel, and then to Afghanistan, where there are clearly, and have been for the last several years, more contractors than uniformed military personnel on the ground. So the footprint of the American military effort has changed pretty dramatically, right? So it's been skewed much more into the area of the contractor. If you also look at the defense budget and the portion of the budget that goes to contractors, that's, since the end of the Cold War, there's been a dramatic transformation. So contractors are there, and the contractors' interests definitely play a disproportionate role. Now, another area where I think we see this is if we look at some of the legal efforts in Congress to address the NSA, the overreach of the NSA, the prison program, for instance. Justin Amash, a Tea Party Republican, and a Democrat from Detroit.
John Conyers.
Who?
Conyers.
Conyers, exactly. Yeah. Well, in any event, they jointly moved to discontinue the prison program. And at one point, we had a news count showing that they had a clear majority in the House of Representatives on their side. And the White House and the Republican leadership jointly engaged in very heavy arm twisting. In fact, General Alexander was sent to Congress for a day to press particularly Republicans who had committed to support the measure. And you got a final vote where the House split right down the middle. In fact, roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans on both sides. So it's not a partisan issue at all. So how could you predict how someone was going to vote? Well, somebody at Politico actually went back and did a very interesting test. So if we look at how much money individual members of Congress took from the defense and intelligence communities, that allowed you with almost 100% accuracy to predict how they would vote. So those who received substantial campaign contributions from those two contractor communities voted with the NSA.
Very interesting discussion, very depressing discussion. Personally, I have no great problem with the CIA as a paramilitary force utilized in places like Yemen and the border areas of Pakistan. But that's a side issue. The main issue is one that you've done a tremendous amount of research on this. You've critiqued it, you've depressed me. Now tell me what you would do to correct the situation.
So I think you have to view this as two different questions. So one is, do we want the CIA to have this military capacity that's really beyond the paramilitary? And I think it's possible to make the case for that. But the other is, if you say, yes, you can go ahead and do this, do you circumvent the entire democratic process for approval of military missions overseas? So if this commitment were given to the Department of Defense, there would be a process. It would be going before Congress. There would be discussion, deliberation, and approval of the mission. And in fact, the Department of Defense is hardwired to do that, and actually does, people may criticize them, I think, generally a really pretty good job of that, presenting it on Capitol Hill, presenting their policy rationalization for what's being done, and actually trying to build public support for the military mission that they undertake. The CIA does none of those things whatsoever. So it's the democratic process that I think is the most important angle here. But beyond that, I think the architecture, I mean, this doesn't match the architecture of the National Security Act of 1947. The National Security Act of 1947 is very clear. It says military campaigns belong to the Department of Defense, not to the CIA. So we've gotten to the stage we're in today by a bunch of national security lawyers. I'm sure some of them trained here at Horton, you know, as John Brennan was, of course, who say that, oh, this is not a military campaign, it's a series of 482 independent covert actions, each and every one of which is totally independent. They have nothing to do with one another. But no, I mean, it's clearly a military campaign. It's gone on over a period of 10 years. And this sort of atomizing, breaking things apart, is intellectually disingenuous, but it's exactly the sort of exercise that our national security lawyers go through all the time right now. I would just say, you know, another major issue that flows from this is when it's secret and you can't talk about it, then you really can't have a proper assessment afterwards about whether it's been successful. So I think each and every one of the 482 covert action strikes can be a success because it hit the person it was supposed to hit and didn't have a lot of collateral damage. But if the result of all of these actions over 10 years is that Pakistan, which President Bush described as our most important non-NATO ally, is actually an enemy, and Pakistan has the largest growing nuclear arsenal in the world, that's not a good thing. And if the result is that Islamist radicals in the tribal areas who were pretty isolated suddenly become integrated with, build tight bonds to the communities in those regions, that's a really bad thing. So I think we haven't had the sort of discussion, tough discussion that has to happen about whether or not this program is a successful program and is a reasonable program. And that's a totally different discussion from whether or not you think it's good to have the technological capacity, because I think that is clearly the case. We do need to have it and need to develop it.
I'm concerned about the culture of secrecy, having secret wars and having secret operations and secret intelligence gathering as being either poisonous or infectious for the rest of the world. To me, it seems like one of the most dangerous things about Putin-style operations is that they're adopting a lot of this, so that we have a secret war by Soviet troops in Ukraine. We have secret operations against spies in London, and secret this and that. And I'm wondering if you think that the American example is simply either legitimizing or else encouraging or somehow in some other way affecting this kind of behavior by other world leaders and by other world powers.
I think there's absolutely no question about it. That's correct. In fact, with respect to Russia, I would say I'd actually seen 2 years ago a leaked policy paper from the FSB, the successor to the KGB, about assassinations. In fact, it used the Russian words for targeted killings over and over again. And when I read it, I was just shocked. This is aping the language of the white paper that Eric Holder used to justify the al-Awlaki killings. And that's not coincidental. I think people there in the Kremlin, believe that, look, if President Bush and President Obama can claim this power and authority and use it for assassinations, well, we can too. I mean, if it's a universal principle of law. And in fact, if we track actions that Putin is engaged in, you talked about Eastern Ukraine. I mean, there was a large targeted killing that occurred in Qatar. There was another that was carried off in Dubai. There's the Litvinenko case in London, which I think you were alluding to. There have been a whole series of other cases involving assassination attempts in Germany and Sweden. So yes, I think that's one of the problems that we have to be conscious of. So if we take the position that the U.S. government has the right and authority to wield lethal force in this way, using drones, striking people around the world, we have to be concerned that other countries will claim exactly the same sort of rights, and that will be, Russia, North Korea, Iran, for instance, will claim. And then we're sort of sliding towards a darker and more difficult world. Well, this is one of the reasons why I'm very critical of the fact that the OLC opinions on drone operations were made secret. I think that, and I think I write that there's nothing, in my mind, having read the opinions now, there's nothing really shocking about these opinions. They tie themselves neatly to law of armed conflict concepts. They're not really radical in any way. But I think it's good for the United States, if it's going to be pursuing a program like this, to say clearly and forcefully, we believe we have the legal right to do it, and here are the criteria that govern that right. So then you get the opinion, and the opinion says, well, this wouldn't apply to London or Berlin or Sweden. This would apply to a place where a country is in turmoil and doesn't have any effective law enforcement. The opinions do say that, So these are vital distinctions. So why the Obama administration wanted to hide these things is just beyond me. And I have to say, thank God to the Second Circuit, because generally our judiciary has been very reluctant to second guess any secrecy claims of the administration. And the Second Circuit handed down I think a brilliant decision, basically saying to the administration, you can't have it two ways. You can't send John O'Brien, an unnamed White House source, to go talk to journalists saying, we're going to kill this al-Awlaki guy, and here's why, and build the case. And then have John Brennan, an unnamed White House source, and another interview, unnamed, say, and we got a Justice Department memo that tells us we have the right to do. If you're going to do that and play this game with the press, then you have to expect that these documents are going to be made publicly available. That's just what our democratic society requires. So, believe in the Second Circuit, they got that just right.
Susan and Phil, and we'll take a vote and then
Hi, how does it affect your main thesis that secrecy undermines democratic accountability? The fact that so many of these national security revelations since 9/11, the revelation of the torture program, the revelation of the drone program, the revelation of the warrantless spying and the NSA spying, and I would argue the biggest mistake we made since 9/11, the Iraq War was done, in full sunlight without secrecy. That once the secret programs were revealed, there hasn't been that much public backlash or public anger. I'd say the NSA revelations, there's been the most movement on that. But Iraq was done with democratic support in a lot of ways. I was in Congress at the time, working in Congress as a staffer. So how does that affect your thesis? Because I think there's something potentially even more sinister going on in the American public than secrecy. And you kind of touch on it in the book when you talk about this lack of investment in things, getting rid of the draft, the technological use of drones, the American public not being invested in warfare and in what's going on across the world. But I was wondering how that affects your larger thesis. Thanks.
Am I supposed to talk first? Okay. Somewhat related. You talked a lot about accountability. I want to ask about oversight. Last year, the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 Commission report, which nobody noticed, they had a lot of laments, and one of their biggest laments was what I call DHS DHS dysfunction, as opposed to microphone dysfunction. Good attempt.
Yeah.
So, DHS dysfunction, what they meant was that there's, I forget the numbers, I think it was in the 90s, the number of committees or subcommittees that have some jurisdiction over our new national security state, the Department of Homeland Security. And, you know, the Senate Intel Committee and what they did on torture, do you think that's a one-off? What about all these committees with overlapping jurisdictions and some jurisdiction over all of these matters you've been talking about? Do you see any hope or possibility of you know, that oversight in improving, whether that's to reveal secrets or just bring the agency in, bring the budgets in?
Okay, well, I think, you know, two big questions, actually. So first, let's look at the Iraq War. I mean, I say in my book that the two Iraq wars are outliers to this process, because of course they occurred openly and with democratic process and huge demonstrations, there were votes in Congress and so forth. Nevertheless, they were influenced by inappropriate invocations of secrecy. So, as I mentioned before, the case to make the case for invading Iraq turned very heavily on claims about weapons of mass destruction and claims of there being a cabal between Al-Qaeda and Saddam. And we now know in retrospect there wasn't the intelligence to support those claims. So secrecy was used basically to give these claims an aura of credibility that they never should have really enjoyed. And I think, you know, in the case, one of the most important things in the Select Committee report is the footnote. It's 857. And we look at that footnote, and we see, and it discusses the case of al-Libi, who was tortured in a CIA proxy arrangement with the Egyptian Secret Service, and tortured to give this information linking Saddam to Al-Qaeda. It was then rushed to, or rather actually it was weapons of mass destruction. It was then rushed to Colin Powell and used by him in the Security Council speech. So this shows you, you know, one of the first documented case in the report about the use of torture techniques, and is used to produce false intelligence, which is used to make the case for the war. So I think we got, you know, huge issues, but these are the same sorts of issues that have existed throughout our history. I mean, you think about the beginning of the Spanish-American War, remember the name and claims that were made then that were wrong about the Tonkin Gulf resolution and so on. So to some extent, that's always going to be there. The bigger problem is, you know, the one that you alluded to. So, I mean, I make the argument that that the Lords of Secrecy had their first big tumble in the world, the first big war in Vietnam. That was the first major war that they managed beginning to end. And at the outset, they really didn't want to have a democratic discussion. They didn't want to have a public discussion of these things. They didn't want to have congressional deliberation. They used the Tonkin Gulf incident as a way to get that authority. But what happened is, you know, they didn't build public support behind the military effort they went into. And I think at the end of the war, you know, even most of Johnson's brain trust, you know, certainly with George Bundy, you know, made very, very clear in his, you know, later remarks that this was a gross mistake, that, you know, actually there's a good reason for this democratic process of building public support and having dialogue. But at the end of Vietnam, there was a huge blowback against this, and I think the elites, national security elites, were frightened by it, and were very, very concerned about the democratic process undermining the country's ability to defend itself in a nuclear age, and be able to project forces robustly as they wanted to. So they set out looking at, you know, what are the factors that spark public interest in foreign affairs and foreign wars, and they identified them, and they set out acting against each of these factors. So, I mean, the first thing was the draft. So if we move to a volunteer army, that's gone. Next thing was then to move to contractors. So Americans are upset when sons and daughters and fathers and cousins come back in coffins. You know, they don't seem to be quite so concerned about contractors.
And indeed, we don't even have to tell them any information about the contractors. We'll just keep that out. And by the way, with the sons and daughters coming back, we don't have to let them photograph the bodies when they arrive at Dover Air Force Base either. And, what's with this crazy idea of the President and the Secretary of Defense sending letters to the mothers and fathers of soldiers who died that only attracts unwelcome attention and press coverage, so let's stop all that sort of stuff. And then finally we get to robotic weaponry. Well, robotic weaponry is the answer, right? So there's no risk of any American being killed if we're fighting a war with robots and with drones. And we actually see this in the OLC opinion that was issued appropriately enough on April Fool's Day 2011, authorizing or justifying the military action in Libya, where it was sort of a throwaway line that's observed that, well, there's no real risk, given our technologies deployed, of American service personnel being harmed. So what right does the public and does Congress have to say anything about this? Not so fair, it's just for the executive. Well, that's, of course, absolutely absurd, but they're right about the core notion that you use all of these factors and the public doesn't become as engaged, doesn't become as concerned. So you may, in fact, have large majorities saying this war is a bad idea, we don't approve it, but it doesn't drive their vote when elections come around. They're just not that worked up about it. It doesn't matter that much to them one way or the other. So that I think is a huge issue. Finally, I'd say secrecy, just generally, you don't know about it, you're not concerned about it. You don't talk about it. There's no basis for debate. So interest is contagious, as a philosopher said. So secrecy is, in another sense, one of the most powerful narcotics that's ever been used for democracy. So keep things secret, they're not going to be discussed, people are not going to worry about them, and secrecy just spreads and numbs steadily. And now we come to the oversight question, and I think this is a huge question. So if you look at the Senate's Committee on Intelligence report, I'll go out on a limb and say this is the best report that Congress has ever delivered on a national security question. It is the most rigorously and thoroughly documented, the best prepared, and even the best written. I have to say, just reading it, I was shocked. I mean, it's really well written. It couldn't be a novel, but I mean, it's a good public affairs book, I would say. So to me, just astonishing, frankly, astonishingly good. At the same time, it documents a failure. So this is a study of a program that wound up in the last quarter of 2006, right? 9 years old, when the report comes out. So it's a historical footnote. Congress is supposed to be dealing with these programs in real time. And it documents, in fact, that Congress didn't deal with these programs in real time. It documents that they made a few queries and sent some letters, and they generally got no answers, or they got false answers, and that was that. They were perfectly happy with that. They didn't push the question any further. They didn't reach in deep as they should have. So I think it documents an amazingly poor legacy. And in my view, that this is the key problem. So Max Weber, for instance, talking about secrecy as a problem, he says there's one obvious cure, and the cure is parliamentary right of oversight. He says this like 4 or 5 times over and over again. Now, Daniel Patrick Moynihan comes around later and says, Max Weber, brilliant man, but the Germans didn't know from parliamentary democracy. Let's face it, they never really had one to begin with. And, we in the United States have a much deeper and richer history of Congress and congressional oversight, and we know enough to know that it ain't that simple. No parliamentary body has the tools, the time, the personnel to perform that sort of oversight. So Moynihan said, no, it's actually a bunch of different things working together. It's a watchdog media covering things and writing stories, because actually to inspire
Congress to do something, generally you've got to have that front page story in some major newspaper that's already done half the work for them, right, to get them going. And it's whistleblowers, and it may be the court pressing and challenging over and over again. All these things working together provide perhaps the basis for real effective oversight and limitation on these problems. But I think what we have to say now is that the problem's accelerating. It's growing dynamically. And the ability of society to rope it in and control it is weaker than it has been in recent periods in our society. And I think we see that in a particular area. I mean, if we look at what happened in the 60s and 70s, exposés published, people are shocked. There are consequences, people are fired, maybe some legislation is adopted, there's effective pushback. What's happened over and over again in the last 15 years is expose, people are a little shocked, not really all that much shocked, a little shocked. There's a lot of discussion about it, and what happens? Nothing really happens to the underlying problem. Things just continue, right? So that's our current paradigm, which is a very dangerous one.
Well, I wanted to end it on an up note.
Good luck.
I'll have to come up, but here's an up note. Let me tell you what's coming up this semester. I'm just going to mention a couple of things. We're doing an event with Cardozo Law School at Cardozo to help them launch their National Security Human Rights Program. And it's going to be on the 26th of this month. And it's going to be the question of where do we stand now on the liberty versus security debate? So, where are we? Especially with the rise of ISIS and et cetera, the rest of the world imploding. So I encourage you to come to that. We'll invite you to it. But the big thing we're doing this semester is on April 27th. We're having an all-day conference called Threats, Profits, and Privacy, about the brewing tensions between the U.S. government and the industry, the telecoms industry. And I think there's some rather significant individuals that will be here to talk to you about that, and I think you should mark your calendar. My final thing, I hope you're all getting the morning brief in the morning and the cyber brief on Mondays. If you're not, let people out there know and we'll put you on the list. The upbeat thing is, winter's more than half over. That's the upbeat thing. That was a wonderful discussion. It's a wonderful book. It's for sale out here, and thank you for joining us.